The old-timers in Millfield, Oregon, still whisper about the winter of 1887, when 4 girls vanished into the Cascade Mountains and emerged 3 months later as something entirely different. They'll tell you about the desperate search parties that combed those treacherous slopes for weeks, finding nothing but frozen footprints and abandoned hope. They'll describe the moment when Sheriff Douglas gave up the hunt, declaring the Patterson sisters lost to the wilderness that had already claimed so many before them. But what they remember most is the day those same 4 girls walked back into town, alive and transformed, following a man nobody had ever seen before. A gentle giant with weathered hands and eyes like ancient forests, who changed everything simply by saying 5 words, "You're coming with me." What happened in those mountains would shatter every assumption the people of Millfield held about survival, family, and the true meaning of salvation. Because sometimes getting lost is the only way to find who you're meant to become. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the Patterson farmhouse with the relentless rhythm of desperation itself. Inside the cramped kitchen, 4 sisters huddled around a table that held more emptiness than food, their hollow eyes reflecting the dying embers of a fire they couldn't afford to keep burning much longer. Margaret Patterson, at 19, the eldest and unwilling head of their fractured household, stared at the meager contents of their last flour sack with the kind of calculation that had become second nature over the past 6 months. 2 cups, maybe 3 if she stretched it with sawdust again. Enough for perhaps a week of the thin gruel that had kept them alive since their father disappeared into the mountains, chasing rumors of a silver strike that would solve all their problems. Beside her, 17-year-old Catherine pressed her lips together in that stubborn line Margaret had come to dread. Catherine had always been the fighter among them, the one who refused to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed to be their only option. Her dark hair hung limp around a face that had grown gaunt over the months of rationing, but her green eyes still burned with the kind of defiance that made her dangerous to herself and everyone around her. "We could sell Mother's wedding ring," Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Mrs. Henderson at the general store has been eyeing it for months." 15-year-old Sarah looked up from where she'd been darning the same sock for the 3rd time, her gentle features twisted with horror. "We can't sell Mother's ring. It's all we have left of her." Sarah had inherited their mother's tender heart, along with her auburn hair, and the thought of parting with any family treasure cut her deeper than hunger itself. The youngest, 13-year-old Rebecca, said nothing. She rarely spoke anymore, not since the night their father had announced his plans to seek their fortune in the mountains and never returned. Rebecca had been the family storyteller, the one who could weave tales that made even their modest circumstances seem magical. But hunger had stolen her voice along with her dreams, leaving behind a girl who moved through their daily struggle like a ghost, haunting her own life. Margaret counted the coins in their emergency jar for the 100th time, knowing the number wouldn't change, no matter how desperately she willed it to. 87 cents. In a world where a loaf of bread cost 15 cents, and winter was approaching with the inevitability of death itself, 87 cents might as well have been nothing at all. The farmhouse around them told the story of their decline in heartbreaking detail. The walls, once painted a cheerful yellow by their mother's loving hands, now showed patches of bare wood where dampness had peeled away both color and hope. Furniture had been sold piece by piece throughout the summer to buy food and heating oil. First, the grandfather clock that had belonged to their mother's family, then the mahogany dining table where they'd shared so many holiday meals. Finally, even the rocking chair where their mother had sung them to sleep during the precious years before consumption, claimed her life. What remained spoke of a family that had once thrived in this remote corner of Oregon. and sewn quilts that their mother had crafted with infinite patience, now providing warmth in a house they could no longer afford to heat. Shelves lined with books their father had insisted on buying, believing education was the one inheritance that could never be taken away. Her kitchen garden visible through the rain-streaked window, where Sarah still coaxed vegetables from soil that seemed as depleted as their spirits. The Patterson family had never been wealthy, but they'd been whole. Their father, Jonas Patterson, had worked the lumber mill in town 6 days a week, coming home each evening with sawdust in his beard and stories that made their simple life seem rich with possibility. Their mother, Elena, had transformed their modest house into a sanctuary of warmth and laughter, where love mattered more than luxury, and dreams were cultivated like flowers in her beloved garden. But consumption had stolen Elena when Rebecca was barely 8 years old, leaving Jonas to raise 4 daughters, while carrying grief that seemed to age him a decade in the span of a single winter. He'd managed for 5 years, working double shifts at the mill and accepting help from neighbors with the kind of grudging gratitude that spoke of a man unaccustomed to charity. The girls had learned to cook and clean and manage a household with the efficiency born of necessity, creating a routine that kept them functioning if not thriving. Then the mill had closed. The news had hit Millfield like a physical blow, sending shockwaves through a community that depended on timber for its very existence. Overnight, dozens of families found themselves without income, without prospects, without hope. Jonas had walked from farm to farm seeking work, but everyone was struggling to survive the economic disaster that had transformed their thriving town into a collection of desperate souls competing for scraps. That's when the stories started. Whispered tales of silver deposits hidden deep in the Cascade Mountains, enough wealth to save not just individual families, but the entire town. Men began to disappear into the wilderness, following rumors and half-remembered legends, chasing salvation in the form of precious metal buried beneath tons of stone and snow. Jonas had resisted longer than most. He'd spent weeks trying to find legitimate work, exhausting every possibility before finally admitting that conventional solutions wouldn't solve their desperate situation. The night before he left, he'd gathered his daughters around the kitchen table and made promises he hoped he could keep. "I'll be back before the first snow," he'd said, his weathered hands trembling as he packed the supplies they couldn't afford to spare. "There's silver up there, girls. Enough to buy back everything we've lost and more. You just need to hold on until I return." Margaret had wanted to beg him not to go, had seen the desperation in his eyes that made this expedition feel more like suicide than salvation. But she was 19 years old and practical enough to understand that staying meant watching her sisters slowly starve to death. If there was even a chance their father could find the silver that would save them, she had to let him try. That had been 3 months ago. 3 months of rationing food until their meals consisted of little more than watered-down soup and hope. 3 months of watching their neighbors' pity transform into suspicion as the Patterson sisters struggled to maintain their independence. 3 months of lying awake at night, listening to Rebecca cry herself to sleep, and Catherine pace the floor like a caged animal plotting escape. The people of Millfield had offered help. Of course, Mrs. Henderson at the general store extended credit until their debt grew so large it embarrassed everyone involved. The Methodist Church organized food donations that kept them alive, but couldn't address the underlying problem of 4 orphaned girls trying to survive in a world that offered women few options for independence. Even Sheriff Douglas had suggested, with awkward kindness, that perhaps it was time to consider splitting up the family, sending the younger girls to relatives in distant cities while Margaret found work as a domestic servant. But Margaret had refused every offer that required breaking up their family. Whatever happened, they would face it together. That promise had sustained her through the darkest moments of the past months. even as she watched her sisters grow thinner and more desperate with each passing day. Now, sitting in their freezing kitchen with winter approaching and their resources nearly exhausted, Margaret wondered if her stubborn insistence on keeping the family together had been compassion or cruelty. Perhaps the practical people of Millfield had been right. Perhaps love sometimes meant letting go, admitting that good intentions couldn't overcome impossible circumstances. Catherine suddenly stood up, her chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sound like fingernails on slate. "I'm going into town tomorrow," she announced, her voice carrying the kind of determination that meant arguing would be pointless. "I'll find work. Someone must need help with something." "Catherine, we've tried that," Margaret said gently. "Mrs. Patterson already has more help than she needs, and the bakery—" "Then I'll go to Portland," Catherine interrupted, her green eyes blazing with desperate resolve. "I'll find work in the city, send money back. There have to be opportunities there for someone willing to work hard." Sarah looked up from her mending, tears already forming in her brown eyes. "We can't split up. We promised we'd stay together no matter what. Staying together won't matter if we're dead," Catherine shot back, her voice cracking with emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. "Look at us, Margaret. Really look. Rebecca hasn't spoken more than 10 words in the past week. Sarah's so thin I can see her ribs through her dress. You're working yourself to death trying to keep us fed on nothing. How is this better than admitting we need help?" The question hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the atmosphere with truth none of them wanted to acknowledge. They were dying by degrees, clinging to the illusion of independence, while their bodies and spirits slowly surrendered to forces beyond their control. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault on their failing roof, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains where their father had vanished in pursuit of salvation that might never have existed at all. Inside the kitchen, 4 sisters faced the reality that love and determination might not be enough to survive what the world had thrown at them. Margaret reached across the table and took Catherine's hand, feeling how cold her sister's fingers had become. "Give me 1 more week," she said quietly. "If Father doesn't return by then, we'll do whatever we have to do. But please, just 1 more week." Catherine's defiance crumbled, revealing the frightened 17-year-old girl beneath the fierce facade. She sank back into her chair and squeezed Margaret's hand with what little strength she had left. "1 more week," she agreed. "But then we make the hard choices, whether we want to or not." None of them could have imagined that within 72 hours, choice would be taken from them entirely. That a blizzard would drive them from their home into the wilderness where death waited with patient hunger. That they would face their darkest hour, not in the safety of their familiar kitchen, but in a forest where survival meant abandoning everything they thought they knew about themselves. The storm that would change everything was already building in the mountains, gathering strength and purpose like fate itself, preparing to intervene in the lives of 4 sisters who had exhausted every conventional path to salvation. Soon, very soon, they would discover that sometimes the only way forward is to lose everything you think you need and trust in the kindness of strangers who appear when hope itself seems dead. But that revelation was still 3 days away, and for now, they could only sit in their failing kitchen, counting coins that would never be enough and making promises they might not live to keep. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The blizzard arrived without warning on the 3rd day, as if the mountain gods had grown tired of watching the Patterson sisters suffer in slow motion and decided to force a resolution with elemental fury. Margaret woke to a silence so profound it felt unnatural. The kind of stillness that comes when snow muffles every familiar sound and transforms the world into something alien and hostile. Through the frost-covered window of their bedroom, she could see nothing but white. Not the gentle snowfall that Oregon winters typically brought, but a wall of driven snow so thick it seemed solid. The wind howled around their house with a voice that spoke of temperatures dropping far below anything their meager fuel supply could combat. "Margaret?" Sarah's voice trembled from the bed she shared with Rebecca. The water bucket froze solid during the night. Margaret pulled on her heaviest coat and made her way to the kitchen, where the reality of their situation became impossible to ignore. Ice had formed on the inside of their windows. Their remaining firewood, carefully rationed to last another week, would be consumed in hours by the kind of fire needed to keep them alive in this weather. Most alarming of all, the cellar door had warped in the cold, sealing shut their access to the root vegetables that represented their only remaining food supply. Catherine appeared in the doorway, her breath visible in small puffs of vapor. "The chimneys blocked with snow," she reported, her practical nature asserting itself even as panic flickered in her green eyes. "I tried to clear it, but there's too much accumulation on the roof. We can't safely burn what little wood we have left." The sisters gathered in the kitchen, drawn together by instincts older than civilization itself. Without heat, without access to their food stores, without any means of communication with the outside world, they faced the stark reality that their week of grace had been cut short by forces entirely beyond their control. Rebecca spoke for the first time in days, her voice barely a whisper. "Are we going to die?" The question hung in the frigid air like a blade, cutting through any pretense that their situation was merely difficult rather than desperate. Margaret looked at her youngest sister's face, so pale it seemed translucent, and felt something break inside her chest. Not just fear, but the terrible recognition that all her efforts to hold their family together might have simply delayed the inevitable. "No," Margaret said firmly, though she had no idea how to make that promise true. "We're going to survive this. We just need to think." But thinking required options, and options seemed to have vanished along with the familiar landscape outside their windows. They couldn't stay in the house without heat or access to food. They couldn't travel to town through a blizzard that had already deposited 3 feet of snow with no signs of stopping. They couldn't even send word to their neighbors that they needed help, assuming anyone could reach them through the storm. Catherine began pacing, her restless energy a counterpoint to the paralyzing cold. "The old mining cabin," she said suddenly. "The one up Miller Creek, where Father used to take us fishing. It's only 3 miles through the forest, and it has a proper stone fireplace." Margaret shook her head immediately. "Catherine, we can't. 3 miles in this weather with no proper winter gear, carrying what little food we have left. It's suicide." "So is staying here," Catherine shot back, her voice rising with desperation. "Look around, Margaret. Really look. We have maybe 6 hours of body heat left before hypothermia sets in. The roof is already creaking under the snow load. If it collapses, we'll be buried alive." As if summoned by her words, a tremendous crack echoed through the house, followed by the ominous groaning of timber under stress. Through the kitchen ceiling, they could see a new sag, where the weight of accumulated snow was testing the limits of their father's construction skills. Sarah moved closer to Margaret, seeking comfort in proximity. "What if we get lost in the forest? What if the cabin is buried or damaged or occupied by someone else? What if we die here waiting for rescue that may never come?" Catherine countered. "At least if we try to reach the cabin, we're taking action. We're fighting for our lives instead of just giving up." The debate continued for precious minutes while the storm raged outside and the temperature inside continued to drop. Margaret found herself caught between her protective instincts and the growing certainty that Catherine was right. Staying meant slow death by cold and starvation. Leaving meant risking quick death by exposure, but with at least the possibility of reaching shelter with a functional fireplace and the tools needed to survive until the storm passed. The decision was made for them when another crack shook the house, this one followed by the sound of something heavy sliding off the roof. Through the front window, they could see their porch had partially collapsed under the weight of snow and ice. If the roof gave way completely, they would face the worst of both worlds: exposure to the elements with no possibility of movement. "We pack light and we pack fast," Margaret announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had accepted an impossible choice. "Warm clothes, the last of the flour, matches, anything that might help us survive. We leave in 1 hour." The next 60 minutes passed in a blur of desperate preparation. They layered every piece of clothing they owned, creating bulky but hopefully protective cocoons against the cold. Sarah packed their mother's silver hairbrush and the family Bible, items that provided no practical value but offered the psychological comfort of connection to better times. Rebecca clutched her one remaining doll, a raggedy thing that had been her constant companion since their mother's death. Catherine assembled what tools they had: their father's hunting knife, a small hatchet for cutting firewood, a length of rope that might prove useful for navigation or emergency shelter. Margaret distributed their remaining food, dividing the pitiful supplies equally among 4 small packs that each sister could carry without becoming exhausted too quickly. As they prepared to leave the only home they'd ever known, Rebecca suddenly broke down completely. "I can't," she sobbed, collapsing onto the kitchen floor. "I can't leave. What if Father comes back and we're not here? What if he's already on his way home and we miss him?" The possibility had haunted all of them, but speaking it aloud made it real in a way that threatened to undermine their resolve. Margaret knelt beside her youngest sister, taking Rebecca's frozen hands in her own. "Father would want us to survive," she said gently. "He would want us to do whatever it takes to stay alive until he can find us. The cabin is where he taught us to fish, where we spent so many happy summers. If he comes looking for us, that's where he'll think to search." It was a lie, and they all knew it. If their father returned during the blizzard, he would expect to find them in the house. He would have no reason to suspect they'd fled to a remote cabin through dangerous conditions. But sometimes lies served love better than truth, and Rebecca needed hope more than she needed honesty. The moment of departure arrived with the finality of a closing door. Margaret took one last look around the kitchen, where they'd shared so many meals, where their mother had taught them to cook, and their father had told stories that made even the simplest evenings feel magical. In a few hours, this room might be buried under tons of snow and ice. Even if they survived the journey to the cabin, they might never see their childhood home again. Catherine opened the back door, and the storm immediately invaded their space with brutal force. Snow drove horizontally through the opening, and the wind carried a cold so intense it felt like being struck with hammers made of ice. Beyond the doorway lay a white void where familiar landmarks had vanished completely. "Stay close," Catherine shouted over the wind. "Hold hands so we don't lose each other. If anyone falls, everyone stops. We move together or not at all." They stepped out into the storm like explorers, leaving the edge of the known world. Within minutes, their house disappeared behind them, swallowed by the white fury that had transformed their familiar forest into an alien landscape of death and disorientation. The cold attacked them immediately, finding every gap in their makeshift winter clothing and driving deep into their bones with claws of ice. The first mile was nightmare made manifest. Snow reached their waists in places, forcing them to break trail through drifts that seemed determined to trap them forever. The wind drove ice crystals into their faces with enough force to draw blood, and the cold was so intense that breathing became a conscious effort. More than once, one of them stumbled and fell, dragging the others down into snow that felt like a frozen grave. But they pressed on, driven by the desperate knowledge that stopping meant death. Catherine led the way with the determination of someone who had accepted that survival required superhuman effort. Margaret followed, counting steps and reciting prayers to keep her mind focused on movement rather than the growing certainty that they had made a terrible mistake. Sarah and Rebecca brought up the rear, supporting each other through sheer force of will. By the second mile, Rebecca could no longer feel her feet. Her lips had turned blue despite the scarf wrapped around her face, and her movements were becoming increasingly uncoordinated as hypothermia began its deadly work. Sarah wasn't much better, stumbling frequently and showing the glassy-eyed confusion that spoke of a mind beginning to shut down in response to extreme cold. "We have to rest," Margaret gasped, her words immediately torn away by the wind. "Just for a few minutes. If we stop, we won't start again," Catherine replied, her voice muffled by the layers of fabric around her face. "The cabin can't be much farther. We just have to keep moving." But even Catherine's iron determination was beginning to crack. The forest around them had become a maze of white uniformity, where every tree looked identical and every direction seemed equally hopeless. The creek they were supposed to follow had vanished under snow and ice, leaving them to navigate by instinct and desperation alone. That's when Rebecca collapsed. She simply stopped walking and sank into the snow, her small body finally surrendering to forces too great for a 13-year-old girl to resist. Sarah immediately knelt beside her, trying to lift her sister through her own exhaustion and failing completely. "I can't get up," Rebecca whispered, her voice so weak it was barely audible over the storm. "I'm so tired. I just want to sleep." Margaret felt terror unlike anything she'd ever experienced. She knew that when exposure victims expressed the desire to sleep, death was often only minutes away. But they were still at least a mile from the cabin, maybe more, and carrying Rebecca through the deep snow would exhaust them all within minutes. Catherine stared at her collapsed sister with wild eyes, her face a mask of desperation and emerging hysteria. "We can't carry her. We can't leave her. We can't stay here." Her voice rose to a scream that the wind immediately devoured. "What are we supposed to do?" For the first time since their ordeal began, Margaret had no answer. They had reached the breaking point where human effort alone was no longer sufficient, where love and determination crashed against the immutable laws of physics and biology, where the choice was no longer between good options and bad options, but between impossible options and certain death. As she knelt in the snow beside Rebecca's motionless form, watching hypothermia claim her youngest sister while the storm raged around them with undiminished fury, Margaret realized they had finally found the edge of what was humanly possible. Beyond this point lay territory that could only be navigated through miracle or surrender. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, white and silent and utterly indifferent to their struggle. Somewhere in that wilderness might be salvation in the form of a cabin with a working fireplace. But Rebecca would never see it, and soon the rest of them would join her in the snow that was already beginning to cover her still form like a burial shroud. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to pray, but found she had no words left for a God who would allow such suffering to befall innocents. Around them the storm continued its relentless assault, and time itself seemed to slow as they faced the moment when fighting became futile and acceptance became the only remaining option. They had reached the breaking point. No, they would discover what lay on the other side of human endurance, where survival became a matter of grace rather than will, and where salvation could only come from sources they had never thought to seek. The silence that followed Rebecca's collapse was more terrifying than the storm itself. In that moment of absolute stillness, as Margaret knelt beside her youngest sister's motionless form, she felt the weight of 3 lives resting entirely on her shoulders. Catherine stood frozen a few feet away, her face a mask of shock and denial. Sarah had sunk to her knees in the snow, her brown eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes from watching hope die in real time. Margaret pressed her ear to Rebecca's chest, listening for the heartbeat that would mean they still had time to save her. The rhythm was there, weak but steady, and Rebecca's breath still fogged in the frigid air. Unconscious, not dead, not yet. But hypothermia was a patient killer, and they were still miles from any shelter that could offer salvation. "She's alive," Margaret announced, her voice cutting through Catherine's rising hysteria. "But we need to get her warm now," Catherine laughed, a sound brittle as breaking ice. "Warm, Margaret, look around. We're in the middle of a blizzard, with no shelter, no fire, no hope. How exactly do you propose we get her warm?" Before Margaret could answer, a new sound penetrated the storm's fury. Not the howling of wind or the crack of breaking branches, but something rhythmic and purposeful. Footsteps, heavy boots crunching through snow with the measured pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going despite the whiteout conditions. Sarah grabbed Margaret's arm, her fingers digging in with desperate strength. "Did you hear that? Someone's coming!" The footsteps grew closer, and through the driving snow emerged a figure that seemed more legend than man. He stood at least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block the wind and a presence that somehow made the chaotic storm feel less overwhelming. His face was weathered by decades of mountain weather, framed by dark hair streaked with silver and a beard that spoke of someone who lived entirely outside civilization's reach. But it was his eyes that captured Margaret's attention completely. Deep brown and infinitely calm, they held the kind of ancient wisdom that comes from years of solitude and communion with forces greater than human ambition. He looked at the 4 sisters with an expression that somehow conveyed both complete understanding of their situation and absolute confidence in his ability to address it. "You're coming with me," he said simply, his voice carrying easily over the storm's roar, despite its conversational tone. Catherine stepped protectively in front of her sisters, her survival instincts overriding her desperation. "Who are you? How did you find us?" The stranger ignored her questions, instead kneeling beside Rebecca's still form, with movements that spoke of extensive experience with emergency situations. He placed one massive hand on her forehead, checking her temperature and consciousness level with the efficiency of someone who had performed such assessments countless times before. "Severe hypothermia, but not beyond recovery if we act quickly," he announced, already shrugging out of a heavy fur-lined coat. "She needs body heat and shelter within the next 30 minutes, or the damage becomes irreversible." He wrapped Rebecca in his coat with gentle precision, then lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. Despite her layers of clothing and waterlogged boots, she seemed tiny against his massive frame. A broken bird, sheltered by hands that had clearly learned to be gentle through necessity rather than nature. "The cabin you're seeking is 3 miles in the wrong direction," he continued, adjusting Rebecca's position to ensure her airway remained clear. "My place is 1/2 mile up the ridge. Stone foundation, proper heating, medical supplies. She'll survive if we move now." Margaret found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "How do you know about the cabin? How do you know what we're looking for?" "Because I know these mountains better than anyone living, and because desperate people always think the same way when they're dying." His tone carried no judgment, only the matter-of-fact assessment of someone who had witnessed such situations before. "You're the Patterson girls from Millfield. Your father passed through my territory 6 weeks ago, heading up towards Silver Creek with mining equipment and more hope than sense." The casual mention of their father sent shockwaves through all 3 conscious sisters. Catherine stepped closer, her green eyes blazing with sudden intensity. "You've seen him? Is he alive? Where is he?" The stranger's expression grew carefully neutral. "Questions for later, when you're all warm and safe. Right now your sister is dying, and discussing your father won't change that reality." Sarah found courage she didn't know she possessed. "Why should we trust you? We don't even know your name." For the first time, something that might have been a smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Name's Ezra Thorne. I've lived alone in these mountains for 15 years, and in all that time, I've never harmed anyone who didn't first try to harm me. But trust isn't really the question here, is it? Your sister needs help that only I can provide, and you need shelter that only I can offer. Everything else is secondary to survival." He was right, and they all knew it. Rebecca's breathing had become even more shallow, and her lips were taking on the bluish tinge that spoke of organs beginning to shut down. Whatever reservations they might have about following, a stranger into the wilderness paled beside the certainty that staying here meant watching their youngest sister die in their arms. Margaret made the decision that would change all their lives. Lead the way, Ezra nodded once, then began moving up the ridge with Rebecca cradled securely against his chest. His steps were sure despite the treacherous footing, and he seemed to navigate by instincts that transcended sight or sound. The sisters followed, Margaret and Catherine, supporting Sarah between them as she struggled to keep pace through snow that reached their thighs in places. The half-mile journey felt like crossing continents. The slope was brutal, testing muscles already exhausted by their earlier efforts, and the wind seemed to grow stronger as they climbed higher into the storm's fury. But Ezra moved ahead of them like a force of nature himself, never slowing, never hesitating, following paths that were invisible to anyone else but seemed as clear as highways to his experienced eyes. How does he know where he's going? Sarah gasped during a brief moment when the wind died down enough for conversation. Because he's lived here long enough to become part of the mountain itself, Catherine replied, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and suspicion. The question is what he wants in return for helping us. Margaret said nothing, but she was wondering the same thing. Men who lived alone in remote places often did so for reasons that made them dangerous to young women in desperate situations. Yet something about Ezra Thorne felt different from the stories she'd heard of mountain hermits and their twisted motivations. His handling of Rebecca was purely medical, professional in a way that suggested extensive experience with emergency care. His demeanor toward them was protective rather than predatory, focused on their immediate needs rather than any opportunities their vulnerability might present. The cabin appeared out of the storm like a mirage made solid. Unlike the rough mining shacks that dotted the mountains, this was clearly a permanent residence built by someone who understood both construction and comfort. The logs were perfectly fitted and professionally chinked. The roof was reinforced with metal that could shed snow loads, and smoke rising from the chimney spoke of warmth that seemed impossible after hours in the freezing wilderness. Inside, "Quickly!" Ezra commanded, kicking open the door with practiced efficiency while keeping Rebecca secure in his arms. Catherine, build up the fire. Margaret, get heated water started. Sarah, find blankets in the chest by the far wall. The interior of the cabin defied every expectation Margaret had formed about hermit dwellings. The main room was spacious and well-organized, with handcrafted furniture that spoke of skill and patience rather than rough expediency. Books lined shelves along one wall, their subjects ranging from medical texts to philosophy to collections of poetry. A kitchen area showed evidence of someone who knew how to cook for himself, and the overall atmosphere was one of comfortable solitude rather than desperate isolation. But it was the medical supplies that truly shocked them. An entire corner of the cabin was dedicated to equipment and medicines that would have impressed a city doctor. Surgical instruments gleamed in felt-lined cases. Bottles of various compounds were labeled with precise handwriting, and bandages and splints were organized with military efficiency. Ezra laid Rebecca on a bed that he quickly surrounded with heated stones and warmed blankets, then began the systematic process of treating severe hypothermia. He worked with the confidence of someone who had performed such procedures many times before, checking her pulse and pupil response while gradually raising her core temperature through techniques that seemed more advanced than anything Margaret had ever witnessed. "She'll live," he announced after 20 minutes of intensive treatment. "Her body temperature is rising steadily, and there's no evidence of frostbite or permanent organ damage. She was closer to death than any of you realize, but she's going to recover completely." The relief that flooded through Margaret was so intense it left her dizzy. Rebecca would live. Whatever else happened, whatever price they might have to pay for this rescue, her youngest sister would survive to see another day. Catherine had been examining the medical equipment with growing amazement. "Where did you learn to do this? Are you a doctor?" Ezra was cleaning his hands with methodical precision, his attention focused on his task rather than their questions. "I was a field surgeon during the war between the states. Learned more about treating trauma and exposure than any man should have to know. When it ended, I came here looking for peace and found I couldn't entirely leave medicine behind. The revelation explained much about his competence, but raised new questions about why a trained physician would choose complete isolation over a comfortable practice in civilization. Margaret studied his weathered features, noting scars that spoke of violence survived and eyes that held shadows of experiences no one should have to endure. "The war ended over 20 years ago," Sarah observed quietly. "You've been up here all this time?" Something flickered across Ezra's face, too quick to interpret, but deep enough to suggest pain that time had failed to heal completely. "Some wounds take longer to mend than others. The mountains have been good medicine for an old soldier's soul." Rebecca stirred on the bed, her eyelids fluttering as consciousness slowly returned. Her first word was barely a whisper, but it carried all the confusion and fear of someone waking from nightmare into uncertainty. "Margaret." "I'm here," Margaret responded immediately, taking her sister's hand and feeling the blessed warmth that indicated circulation returning to normal. "We're all here. We're safe." Rebecca's gaze moved around the unfamiliar room, taking in the warm firelight and comfortable surroundings before settling on Ezra's imposing figure. "Who are you?" "Someone who believes 4 sisters shouldn't die in a blizzard when there's a warm cabin within walking distance," he replied gently. "Rest now. Your body needs time to recover from what it's been through." As Rebecca drifted back into healing sleep, the remaining sisters found themselves facing a new reality. They were safe, warm, and alive, but they were also completely dependent on a man they barely knew in a place where help was days away, even in good weather. The storm still raged outside, making immediate departure impossible, and their own home was likely buried or destroyed by now. Margaret looked at her sisters, seeing her own mix of gratitude and apprehension reflected in their faces. They had been saved, but salvation had come from a source they never could have anticipated. Now they would discover whether their rescue was truly the blessing it appeared to be, or something more complicated than simple kindness. Ezra Thorne had given them life when death seemed certain. The question that would determine their future was what he would ask for in return, and whether they possessed the wisdom to navigate whatever challenges lay ahead in this sanctuary that felt both like salvation and like stepping into an entirely unknown world. The first night in Ezra Thorne's cabin passed in a haze of exhausted sleep and gradual awakening to a reality none of the Patterson sisters could have imagined. 24 hours earlier, Margaret woke before dawn to the sound of wood being split outside, the rhythmic thunk of an axe cutting through timber with practiced efficiency. Through the window, she could see Ezra working in the pale pre-dawn light, his massive frame moving with the fluid precision of someone who had performed this task thousands of times. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow lay 3 feet deep across the landscape, turning familiar forests into alien territory where landmarks had vanished beneath crystalline blankets. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant crack of settling timber and the soft whisper of wind through pine boughs, heavy with their frozen burden. Rebecca stirred in the bed beside her, color having returned to her cheeks after a night of healing sleep. Her eyes, when they opened, were clear and alert, rather than clouded with the confusion that had marked her hypothermic state. "I feel better," she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the sanctuary they'd found. "You look better," Margaret replied, relief evident in her voice. "How much do you remember about yesterday?" Rebecca's brow furrowed as she searched her memory. The cold, walking through snow that seemed to go on forever. Falling down and not being able to get up again, she paused, her gaze finding Ezra's figure through the window. "Then someone picked me up. Someone warm and strong who made everything feel safer." Catherine was already awake at the table, studying the medical books Ezra had left open the night before. Her practical mind was clearly working to understand their situation, cataloging resources and assessing their host's capabilities. With the systematic approach that had helped her family survive, Their father's absence. He's been treating people up here for years, she announced quietly. These journals document dozens of cases. Miners with broken bones, trappers with infected wounds, even delivering babies for families who couldn't reach town in time. He's been like a one-man hospital for anyone who needed help in the backcountry. Sarah joined them at the table, her auburn hair catching the morning light streaming through the windows. But why? If he's really a trained surgeon, why live up here alone instead of practicing in a city where he could help more people and live comfortably? The question hung in the air as Ezra himself entered the cabin, bringing with him the scent of pine and cold mountain air. He moved to the stove with economic efficiency, beginning preparations for breakfast without seeming to notice their scrutiny. But Margaret caught the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested he was acutely aware of their conversation, because sometimes helping people, one at a time, is more honest than processing them through institutions that care more about profit than healing, he said quietly, not turning from his cooking. And because some wounds can only heal in places where the silence is deeper than the pain. The cryptic response raised more questions than it answered, but something in his tone discouraged further inquiry. Instead, Margaret found herself focusing on the immediate practicalities of their situation. How long before we can return to town? Our neighbors will be worried, and we need to assess the damage to our house. Ezra ladled porridge into wooden bowls, adding honey and dried fruit with the automatic gestures of someone accustomed to solitary meals. The trail down to Millfield won't be passable for at least a week, maybe 2, depending on whether we get more snow. Even then, you'll need proper winter gear and someone who knows the safe routes. Catherine looked up sharply from the medical journal she'd been reading. Are you saying we're trapped here? I'm saying the mountains don't care about human schedules or convenience, Ezra replied evenly. You're safe, warm and fed. That's more than most people in your situation could hope for. Whether you consider that trapped or rescued depends on your perspective. The distinction was subtle but significant. Trapped implied helplessness, a situation beyond their control where they were victims of circumstance. Rescued suggested agency, the opportunity to make choices about their future rather than simply enduring whatever fate imposed upon them. As they shared breakfast, Rebecca surprised everyone by asking the question they'd all been avoiding. Mr. Thorne, you said you knew our father. Is he... She couldn't finish the sentence, but the fear in her young voice was unmistakable. Ezra set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, his weathered features showing the internal debate of someone choosing between comfortable lies and difficult truths. Your father made it as far as Silver Creek. I saw him there 6 weeks ago, camped with 3 other men from Millfield who were also searching for silver deposits. Margaret felt her heart skip. Made it as far as Silver Creek? What happened after that? There was an early snowfall that caught them unprepared. 2 of the men turned back, recognizing the danger. Your father and Walt Henderson decided to press on toward the high country, convinced they were close to a significant find. The name Walt Henderson sent shockwaves through all 4 sisters. Walt was the husband of the woman who ran the general store, a steady family man with children of his own. If he had ventured into the dangerous high country alongside their father, the silver fever must have been more desperate and widespread than they'd realized. Have you seen them since? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ezra's silence stretched long enough to become answer in itself. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who had seen too much death in wild places. The high country claimed them, most likely. Been die up there every winter, and this one's been harder than most. I'm sorry. The simple declaration hit them like a physical blow. Margaret felt the breath leave her lungs as the last hope she'd been carrying died in her chest. Catherine's face went pale, and Sarah began crying silently, tears streaming down her cheeks without sound. But it was Rebecca's reaction that broke Margaret's heart completely. The youngest sister simply nodded, as if she'd known all along that their father wasn't coming home. We're orphans now, Rebecca said matter-of-factly. Completely alone. No, Ezra's voice cut through their grief with unexpected firmness. "You're not alone. You're here, you're alive, and you have each other. That's more than many people can claim, and it's enough to build a future on if you're willing to do the work." Margaret looked up at him through her tears, seeing something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Not pity, but a kind of recognition that spoke of personal experience with loss and survival. "You talk like someone who's been where we are." For a moment, Ezra's carefully controlled facade slipped, revealing glimpses of pain that ran deeper than any physical wound. "I lost my family during the war, wife and daughter to cholera, while I was away treating wounded soldiers. Came home to find their graves and a house full of memories I couldn't bear to live with. The admission hung in the air like smoke, connecting them through shared experience of devastating loss. But where their grief was fresh and raw, his had been tempered by years of solitude and acceptance. He'd found a way to build meaning from tragedy, creating a life of service that honored what he'd lost, rather than simply mourning it. Catherine wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders, her practical nature reasserting itself even in the face of overwhelming emotion. "So what happens now? We can't go back to Millfield with no money, no home, and no family to support us. We can't stay here indefinitely as charity cases. What options do we actually have?" The question forced them all to confront the harsh realities of their situation. 4 unmarried sisters with no inheritance, no marketable skills beyond basic domestic work, and no male relatives to provide protection or financial support. In 1887, such circumstances often led to desperate choices, hasty marriages to unsuitable men, indenture as domestic servants, or worse. Ezra refilled his coffee cup, his movements deliberate as he considered his words. "You could stay here through the winter. Learn skills that would serve you no matter where you end up. By spring, you'll be strong enough and capable enough to choose your own path instead of accepting whatever scraps the world offers." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation like ice breaking on a frozen river. "What kind of skills?" "Practical ones. Medical training, since there's always need for people who can tend wounds and treat illness. Wilderness survival, because knowing how to live off the land makes you independent in ways most people can't imagine. Self-defense, because the world isn't always kind to women traveling alone." Sarah looked skeptical. "You teach us those things? Why would you do that for strangers?" Ezra's gaze moved to the window, where morning light revealed the vast wilderness that had become his domain. "Because 15 years ago, I was broken in ways that seemed irreparable. These mountains taught me that healing comes through purpose, that the best way to honor what you've lost is to prevent others from suffering the same fate." He turned back to them, his brown eyes holding depths of experience they were only beginning to understand. "You're not charity cases. You're survivors who've proven you'll fight for each other, even when fighting seems hopeless. That's rare enough to be worth investing in." Rebecca, who had been quiet since learning of their father's fate, suddenly spoke up. "If we stayed, if we learned these things, would we have to live up here forever? Away from everyone and everything?" "That would be your choice," Ezra replied. "What I'm offering is knowledge and strength. How you use them is entirely up to you. Some people find their calling in wild places. Others use wilderness skills to navigate civilized world more safely. The tools are the same. The applications are limitless." Margaret looked at her sisters, seeing her own thoughts reflected in their faces. Fear, certainly, but also something that might have been excitement. For the first time since their troubles began, they were being offered options beyond simple survival. They were being invited to become something more than victims of circumstance. "We'd be leaving behind everything we've ever known," Catherine said slowly. "Our old life, our identities as the Patterson sisters from Millfield, our dreams of conventional happiness and security." "Yes," Ezra agreed. "But what exactly are you leaving behind? A house you couldn't afford to keep? A community that saw you as burdens rather than assets? Dreams that were never really yours to begin with?" The questions cut to the heart of their situation with surgical precision. What really were they giving up? Their childhood home was likely destroyed. Their father was dead. Their place in Millfield society had been tenuous at best, dependent on charity and pity rather than genuine belonging. Margaret felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. But for the first time in months, it didn't feel crushing. Instead, it felt like possibility. "How long do we have to decide?" "As long as you need," Ezra replied. "Winter isn't going anywhere, and neither am I. But understand that choosing this path means committing completely. Half measures don't survive in country like this." As the morning progressed and they began to understand the scope of what he was offering, the sisters found themselves stepping across an invisible threshold. Behind them lay everything familiar but ultimately limiting. Ahead stretched territory that was unknown, but rich with potential for transformation. They were leaving the known world of conventional expectations and entering a realm where survival depended on capability rather than compliance, where strength mattered more than propriety, where they could define themselves rather than accepting definitions imposed by others. The choice before them wasn't just about winter shelter or practical education. It was about becoming something entirely new, something their old world would never have allowed them to imagine, much less achieve. They were being offered the chance to shed their identities as victims and emerge as something powerful, enough to shape their own destiny. The mountains waited with infinite patience to see what they would choose. The decision came not through grand declarations or dramatic pronouncements, but through the quiet accumulation of small choices that gradually shifted the direction of their lives. It began with Margaret asking Ezra to show her how to properly clean and dress a wound after Sarah cut her hand while helping with food preparation. It continued with Catherine requesting instruction in identifying edible plants and safe water sources. By the end of their first week, all four sisters had unconsciously committed to a winter education that would transform them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Ezra proved to be a teacher unlike any they had encountered in their formal schooling. Where their previous education had emphasized memorization and compliance, his instruction focused on practical application and critical thinking. He didn't simply tell them which plants were edible. He taught them to recognize the subtle differences between nutritious berries and poisonous ones, to understand the seasonal patterns that determined availability, to develop the observational skills that could mean the difference between sustenance and starvation. "Knowledge without understanding is just trivia," he explained during one of their morning lessons on wilderness medicine. "Understanding without practice is philosophy. You need all three working together to survive situations where there's no room for error." The medical training began with basic anatomy, but quickly progressed to practical procedures that would have scandalized their former neighbors. Margaret learned to set broken bones using splints carved from mountain ash and secured with strips of buckskin. Catherine mastered the art of suturing wounds with thread made from sinew, her naturally steady hands proving ideally suited for delicate surgical work. Even Sarah, whose gentle nature initially recoiled from the sight of blood, discovered she had an intuitive understanding of herbal remedies and their proper preparation. Rebecca, despite being the youngest, showed remarkable aptitude for diagnosis. Her quiet observation skills, once focused on creating stories about people she watched, now enabled her to recognize symptoms and patterns that escaped her older sisters. She could identify the onset of fever hours before it became obvious to others, spot signs of infection that might otherwise go unnoticed until they became dangerous. "She has the gift," Ezra observed after watching Rebecca correctly diagnose a case of pneumonia in a trapper who had sought shelter during a brief snowstorm. "Some people are born knowing how to see what's really happening beneath surface appearances. It's a rare talent that no amount of training can create, but the medical education was only one aspect of their transformation. Ezra also taught them practical survival skills that challenged every assumption they'd held about their own capabilities. They learned to build fires in conditions that would defeat most experienced outdoorsmen, using techniques that worked even when wood was damp and tinder scarce. They mastered the art of constructing emergency shelters from materials available in any forest, creating structures that could preserve life even in bitter cold. The physical demands of their education astonished them all. Margaret, who had considered herself reasonably strong from years of household labor, discovered muscles she never knew existed as she learned to fell trees with a properly wielded axe. Catherine's competitive nature drove her to excel at tasks requiring endurance and determination, like tracking wounded animals through difficult terrain or maintaining alertness during long nights of guard duty. Sarah's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. The gentle sister who had once fainted at the sight of butchering chickens learned to skin and preserve game with clinical efficiency. Her naturally nurturing instincts, guided by Ezra's instruction, developed into genuine healing abilities that went beyond mere technical competence to encompass the intuitive understanding of when to push and when to show. Patience, healing isn't just about fixing what's broken. Ezra explained during one of their evening discussions around the cabin's great stone fireplace. It's about understanding the whole person, the context of their injury, the resources they have available for recovery. Sometimes the medicine is less important than the hope you provide along with it. The winter deepened around them, but instead of feeling trapped by the isolation, the sisters found themselves energized by challenges that would have seemed impossible months earlier. They learned to read weather patterns with the accuracy of natural barometers, predicting storms hours in advance by observing subtle changes in wind direction and cloud formation. They mastered the art of preserving food through smoking and salting, ensuring adequate nutrition through months when fresh provisions were impossible to obtain. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to trust their own judgment in situations where conventional wisdom provided no guidance. When a family of settlers arrived at the cabin half-frozen and suffering from severe malnutrition, the sisters took charge of their care with confidence that surprised everyone, including themselves. Margaret organized triage procedures. Catherine prepared warming treatments. Sarah mixed herbal remedies, and Rebecca monitored vital signs with the precision of an experienced nurse. "Where did you girls learn such skills?" the grateful father asked as his family recovered under their competent care. "From someone who believes women are capable of more than most people imagine," Margaret replied, surprising herself with the pride in her voice. The comment sparked a conversation that revealed the broader implications of their education. Word of their capabilities was spreading through the scattered mountain communities, carried by trappers and traders who had witnessed their medical skills firsthand. People were beginning to speak of the Thorne sisters, as they had come to be known, with the kind of respect usually reserved for trained physicians. "That's not accurate," Catherine pointed out during one of their discussions. "We're not actually his sisters." Ezra, who had been quietly mending harness leather by the fire, looked up with an expression that might have been amusement. "Family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about choosing to care for each other through circumstances that would defeat most people. In every way that matters, you've become my sisters." The statement hung in the warm air of the cabin like a benediction, acknowledging the bonds that had formed through shared purpose and mutual respect. They had indeed become a family, but one built on choice rather than accident of birth, on earned trust rather than assumed obligation. As the weeks progressed, their education expanded beyond practical skills to encompass philosophy and perspective. Ezra shared stories from his years in the wilderness, tales of people who had faced impossible situations and emerged stronger for the experience. He spoke of the difference between surviving and thriving, between enduring hardship and transforming it into wisdom. "Strength isn't about avoiding difficulty," he explained during one of their evening lessons. "It's about developing the capabilities needed to navigate whatever challenges life presents." Most people spend their energy trying to control their circumstances. Truly strong people focus on controlling their responses to circumstances. The distinction became a cornerstone of their developing worldview. Instead of seeing themselves as victims of their father's death and their family's economic collapse, they began to understand these tragedies as catalysts for growth they never could have achieved under comfortable circumstances. Their losses had stripped away illusions and forced them to discover resources they never knew they possessed. Rebecca, who had been the quietest and most fragile of the sisters, began to show signs of emerging strength that surprised everyone. Her storytelling gift, dormant since their father's departure, returned in the form of detailed case studies that helped them remember and apply their medical training. She created narratives that connected symptoms to treatments, weaving together technical knowledge and human understanding in ways that made complex information memorable and meaningful. Every injury tells a story, she explained, while helping treat a minor's infected wound. If you listen carefully, the story tells you not just what happened, but what needs to happen next for healing to occur. Sarah's development was equally remarkable, though in different directions. Her natural empathy, guided by Ezra's instruction, evolved into sophisticated understanding of human psychology under stress. She learned to recognize the signs of depression and despair that often accompanied physical injuries in isolated communities, developing counseling skills that complemented their medical training. Sometimes fixing the body is the easy part, she observed after helping a widow through grief-induced illness. The real challenge is helping people find reasons to want to get better. Catherine's transformation took the form of strategic thinking that went beyond immediate survival to encompass long-term planning. She began to see patterns in the flow of people seeking their help, identifying needs that weren't being met by existing resources. Her mind, always practical, started designing solutions to problems that affected entire communities rather than individual patients. We could establish way stations, she suggested during one of their planning discussions. Places where travelers could find basic medical care and supplies. Not just emergency treatment, but preventive care that would keep small problems from becoming life-threatening ones. Margaret's evolution was perhaps the most subtle, but ultimately the most significant. Her natural leadership abilities, honed by years of holding her family together through crisis, expanded to encompass vision and inspiration. She began to see their education not as preparation for returning to their old lives, but as the foundation for creating entirely new possibilities. We're not just learning skills, she realized aloud during one of their evening conversations. We're becoming something that didn't exist before, something the world needs, but doesn't know how to create through conventional channels. As winter reached its deepest point, the sisters found themselves facing a crucial realization. They were no longer the desperate, starving girls who had stumbled into the forest months earlier. They had become competent, confident women capable of providing essential services to people who had nowhere else to turn. More importantly, they had discovered that helping others in genuine need provided satisfaction that exceeded anything their previous lives had offered. The transformation was so complete that when spring travelers brought news from Millfield, the sisters listened with the detached interest of people hearing about a foreign country. Their old community, their former neighbors, their previous concerns seemed to belong to different people entirely. They had not simply acquired new skills, they had become new people, shaped by challenges that had revealed capabilities they never suspected they possessed. "Do you miss it?" Ezra asked one evening as they watched late winter snow fall beyond the cabin windows. "The life you left behind?" Margaret considered the question carefully, thinking of the desperate kitchen meetings and the constant worry about money and food and social acceptance. "I miss the simplicity of it," she said finally. "But I don't miss the helplessness. I don't miss measuring my worth by other people's approval or defining success by conventional standards that never felt authentic." Catherine nodded in agreement. "I miss the safety of knowing what was expected of me, even when those expectations felt wrong. But I don't miss the frustration of having capabilities that no one wanted to acknowledge or develop. Sarah's response was characteristically gentle but profound. I miss believing that someone else would always be responsible for solving our problems. But I don't miss the anxiety that came with that dependence, never knowing if the people we relied on would continue to be willing or able to help. Rebecca, who had found her voice again through their education, offered the observation that surprised them all with its maturity. I miss the stories I used to tell myself about how life was supposed to work out. But I don't miss the disappointment when reality refused to match those stories. The life we're building now is better than any story I ever imagined. Their learning phase was drawing to a close, but the women they were becoming had barely begun to explore the possibilities that lay ahead. Spring would bring choices about their future, but those choices would be made by people who understood their own strength and knew how to use it in service of something greater than mere survival. The mountains had taught them well, and now they were ready to discover what they could teach the world. Spring arrived in the mountains with deceptive gentleness, melting snow revealing a landscape transformed by months of winter's harsh embrace. What had been familiar trails were now carved into new configurations by avalanches and erosion. The Patterson sisters, now seasoned by their education in survival and healing, found themselves facing a challenge that would test everything they had learned. Not a medical emergency or wilderness crisis, but something far more complex and dangerous, the return of human civilization to their sanctuary. The first sign of trouble came with Marcus Brennan, a territorial marshal who arrived at Ezra's cabin during the second week of March. Brennan was a man built like a cavalry officer, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. His official badge carried the authority of distant governments, but his demeanor suggested someone who had spent too many years enforcing laws in places where justice was negotiable and survival often required moral flexibility. "Dr. Thorne," Brennan announced, using the title with subtle mockery. "I've been hearing interesting reports about medical services being provided up here without proper licensing or territorial oversight. Thought it was time to investigate personally." Ezra stepped out of the cabin with the calm dignity that had become familiar to the sisters over their months together. Behind him, Margaret, Catherine, Sarah, and Rebecca arranged themselves in defensive formation without conscious thought, their instincts honed by months of facing unexpected challenges together. "Marshal Brennan," Ezra replied evenly, "I wasn't aware that helping injured people required territorial permission. Has the law changed since I've been up here?" Brennan's smile carried no warmth. "The law requires that medical practitioners be properly trained, licensed, and supervised by qualified authorities. From what I understand, you've been operating a kind of field hospital up here with the assistance of 4 young women who have no legal standing to provide medical care." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. During their months of education and service, they had never considered the legal implications of their growing medical practice. In the isolation of the mountains, surrounded by grateful patients who needed their help desperately, the question of official authorization had seemed irrelevant. But now they were forced to confront the reality that their capabilities meant nothing. In the face of bureaucratic requirements, they had neither sought nor satisfied. These women have received more practical medical training in 6 months than most doctors get in 4 years of formal education, Ezra said, his voice carrying an edge of steel. "They've saved lives, prevented suffering, and provided services to people who had nowhere else to turn. What exactly is your objection to that?" Brennan dismounted from his horse and approached the group with the casual authority of someone accustomed to having his presence change the dynamics of any situation. "My objection is that territorial law requires medical practitioners to be licensed through proper channels. It also requires that unmarried women engaged in medical practice be supervised by qualified male physicians who can vouch for their moral character and professional competence." Catherine stepped forward, her green eyes blazing with the kind of anger that had sustained her through their family's worst troubles. And what qualified male physician supervised Florence Nightingale when she transformed military medicine during the Crimean War? What licensing board authorized Clara Barton to establish the American Red Cross? The marshal's expression hardened. "Miss Patterson, I presume?" "Yes, I know who you are, all of you. 4 sisters who disappeared during a blizzard and were presumed dead until reports started circulating about female healers operating in the backcountry. The use of their real name sent a chill through all 4 sisters. They had grown comfortable with their new identities as the Thorne sisters, the skilled healers who served mountain communities with competence and compassion, being reduced once again to the Patterson sisters, the desperate, starving girls from Millfield, felt like being stripped of months of growth and achievement. Sarah found her voice, though it trembled slightly. "We've harmed no one. We've helped everyone who sought our assistance. Why is that a problem for territorial authorities?" Brennan's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Because 4 unmarried women living alone with a man in the wilderness presents questions of moral propriety that reflect badly on territorial governance. Because unlicensed medical practice creates liability issues that territorial courts will eventually have to address. And because people are starting to ask uncomfortable questions about why these services aren't being provided through proper medical establishments in recognized communities." Margaret understood immediately that this wasn't really about medical licensing or legal oversight. This was about control, about forcing unconventional arrangements back into acceptable social patterns, about preventing women from demonstrating capabilities that challenge traditional assumptions about gender roles and professional boundaries. "What exactly are you proposing, Marshal?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled despite the anger building in her chest. Brennan consulted a document from his jacket, reading with bureaucratic precision. "Dr. Thorne will report to territorial authorities for evaluation of his medical credentials and explanation of his activities in this region. The 4 Patterson sisters will return to Millfield, where proper arrangements will be made for their supervision and integration into appropriate social roles." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by wind through pine trees and the distant sound of melting snow running off mountain slopes. Margaret felt the weight of decision pressing down on her once again. But this time, the choice was between submission to authority that neither understood nor valued what they had become, and resistance that might carry consequences none of them were prepared to face. Rebecca, who had remained quiet during the confrontation, suddenly spoke with clarity that surprised everyone. "And if we refuse?" Marshal Brennan's expression became deadly serious. "Then I'll be forced to enforce territorial law through whatever means necessary. Dr. Thorne will be arrested for practicing medicine without proper authorization and maintaining an inappropriate household arrangement. You 4 will be taken into territorial custody as abandoned persons, requiring state supervision." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, poisoning the atmosphere with implications none of them wanted to fully consider. Arrest would mean the end of everything they had built together, the destruction of the medical practice that served vital community needs, the separation of the family they had chosen to create through shared purpose and mutual care. But more than that, it would mean the negation of everything they had discovered about their own capabilities and worth. They would be forced back into roles as helpless females, requiring male supervision and protection, their months of education and achievement dismissed as irrelevant to their proper social function. Ezra stepped closer to his adopted sisters, his massive presence somehow making them all feel safer despite the impossibility of their situation. "Marshal, these women have demonstrated medical competence that exceeds many licensed physicians I've known. They've served communities that had no other access to health care. They've built something valuable that territorial law apparently has no mechanism for recognizing or protecting." "That's not my problem," Brennan replied curtly. My job is to enforce territorial law, not to evaluate its wisdom or fairness. You have until tomorrow morning to decide how you want to handle this situation. Compliance or consequences, the choice is yours. After the marshal departed to make camp lower on the mountain, the 5 members of their chosen family gathered around the cabin's great stone fireplace to confront the crisis that threatened to destroy everything they had built together. The sisters sat in chairs that had become familiar through months of evening discussions, but the comfortable routine felt fragile now, threatened by forces beyond their ability to control or negotiate. "We could run," Catherine suggested, her practical mind already working on logistics. "Head deeper into the mountains, establish ourselves somewhere beyond territorial jurisdiction." Sarah shook her head immediately. "And abandon everyone who depends on our services. Leave patients without medical care because we're unwilling to face bureaucratic challenges." "We could fight," Rebecca added quietly. "Challenge the territorial authority in court. Argue that our medical practice serves essential community needs that aren't being met through conventional channels." Margaret looked at each of her sisters in turn, seeing her own conflicted emotions reflected in their faces. "And spend years in legal battles with uncertain outcomes while our work is suspended and our patients suffer? Even if we eventually won, the cost would be enormous." The discussion continued through the night, exploring options that ranged from impossible to merely desperate. They could seek licensing through proper channels, but that would require leaving the mountains for formal education they couldn't afford and might not be available to women. They could try to find a licensed physician willing to supervise their work, but that would mean subjecting themselves to authority that might not understand or support their methods. Most frustrating of all, they could comply with the marshal's demands and return to Millfield, accepting whatever appropriate social roles territorial authorities deemed suitable for 4 unmarried sisters with no family protection. The thought of surrendering their hard-won independence and returning to lives of dependence and limitation felt like choosing death over life. As dawn approached, Ezra made a proposal that shocked them all with its implications. "There is one option we haven't considered. It's dangerous, it's unprecedented, and it would require courage beyond anything you've already demonstrated. But it might allow you to keep working while satisfying territorial legal requirements." The sisters leaned forward, desperate for any alternative to the impossible choices they faced. Territorial law requires female medical practitioners to be supervised by qualified male physicians. Ezra continued carefully. "It doesn't specify that the supervision has to occur in established communities or through conventional institutional arrangements. If we were to expand our practice, formalize our training programs, and establish this location as a recognized medical facility serving backcountry communities, we might be able to satisfy legal requirements while maintaining our independence." Margaret felt her heart begin to race. "You're talking about creating something entirely new, a medical institution that operates outside traditional urban centers, serving populations that conventional medicine can't or won't reach. I'm talking about proving that what we've built here has value that territorial authorities should recognize rather than destroy," Ezra replied. "It would mean taking our informal practice and making it official, complete with proper documentation, standardized procedures, and the kind of record-keeping that bureaucrats require." Catherine's eyes lit up with understanding. "A mountain medical college. A place where women could receive practical training in wilderness medicine and backcountry healthcare. Something that serves real needs while meeting legal requirements for supervision and authorization." The idea was audacious beyond anything they had previously imagined. Instead of hiding from territorial authority or submitting to its limitations, they would challenge it to recognize new possibilities for medical education and practice. They would prove that women could provide essential services in environments where traditional medical establishments were impractical or impossible. But The plan would also mean exposing themselves to scrutiny that could destroy them if they failed to meet official standards. It would require documentation, formal curricula, standardized procedures, and the kind of institutional structure that none of them had experience creating. Most dangerously, it would put them at the center of a confrontation between conventional medical authority and innovative approaches to healthcare delivery. As Marshal Brennan returned to receive their decision, the sisters realized they faced the ultimate test of everything they had learned during their months of transformation. Not just their medical skills or survival capabilities, but their courage to stand for principles that mattered more than personal safety. Their willingness to risk everything they had built in service of something larger than themselves. Margaret stood to meet the territorial representative, her sisters arrayed beside her in solidarity that had been forged through shared hardship and mutual support. Whatever they decided in the next few minutes would determine not just their individual futures, but the possibility that other women might someday have access to the kind of education and opportunity they had discovered in these mountains. The real test had arrived, and everything they had become would be measured against forces determined to reduce them once again to acceptable social categories. Their response would determine whether their transformation had given them strength enough to reshape the world that sought to diminish them, or whether they would be forced to surrender the authentic lives they had fought so hard to create. Margaret stepped forward to face Marshal Brennan with the measured confidence that months of impossible challenges had taught her. Behind her, her sisters stood in formation that had become instinctive, not the helpless huddle of victims, but the disciplined arrangement of capable women prepared to defend what they had built together. "Marshal Brennan," she began, her voice carrying across the mountain clearing with authority that surprised even herself. "We've made our decision. We will not abandon our medical practice, and we will not submit to supervision that doesn't recognize our demonstrated competence. Instead, we propose to establish the first Mountain Medical Institute, with proper territorial recognition and official oversight." The Marshal's expression shifted from bureaucratic confidence to genuine confusion. This was clearly not one of the responses he had anticipated. "Miss Patterson, I don't think you understand the seriousness of your situation. Territorial law doesn't provide mechanisms for negotiating with unlicensed practitioners who refuse to comply with established regulations." Catherine stepped beside her sister, her practical mind already working through the logistics of their audacious proposal. "Then perhaps territorial law needs to expand its understanding of what medical practice can look like when it serves populations that conventional medicine ignores. We're not asking for exemptions from oversight," Sarah added, her gentle voice somehow carrying as much steel as Catherine's defiance. "We're proposing to create oversight structures that actually serve the communities depending on our services." Rebecca, who had found her voice through months of transformation, completed their united front. "We're offering to prove that what we've built here has value worth preserving rather than destroying, Marshal." Brennan looked at the four sisters with growing recognition that his straightforward law enforcement mission had evolved into something far more complex. These were not the desperate, starving girls he had expected to find. They possessed confidence, competence, and united purpose that challenged every assumption he had made about their situation. Ezra stepped forward, his imposing presence lending weight to their proposal. "Marshal, what these women are suggesting is the establishment of a legitimate medical institution that serves backcountry communities while satisfying territorial requirements for supervision and documentation. I have the credentials to provide official oversight, and they have demonstrated abilities that exceed most formally trained practitioners." The Marshal spent long minutes studying the group before him, clearly calculating political implications that went far beyond simple law enforcement. Even if territorial authorities were willing to consider such an arrangement, the practical requirements would be enormous. You'd need formal curricula, documented procedures, standardized record-keeping, regular inspections, approved facilities, all of which we're prepared to provide, Margaret interrupted confidently. We've maintained detailed medical records throughout our practice. We've developed training protocols that have proven effective with multiple students. We've established patient care standards that could serve as models for other remote medical facilities. The claim was ambitious, but not empty. During their months of education and service, they had unconsciously created many of the institutional structures that formal medical establishments required. Their patient records were meticulous, their treatment protocols were systematic, and their training methods had successfully educated several miners and trappers in basic medical procedures. But transforming their informal practice into an officially recognized institution would require far more than documentation and good intentions. They would need to convince territorial authorities that their approach to medical education and practice served genuine public interests rather than simply providing cover for unconventional arrangements that challenged established social order. You're asking territorial government to recognize something that has never existed before, Brennan said slowly. A medical college operated by women, serving remote communities, using educational methods that no established medical school has ever employed. Catherine's smile was sharp as a blade. Marshal, this territory exists because people were willing to create things that had never existed before. Towns where there had been wilderness, industries where there had been empty land, communities where there had been isolation. Why should medical education be exempt from that same pioneering spirit? The question struck at fundamental assumptions about progress and innovation that territorial authorities claimed to represent. Oregon Territory marketed itself as a place where ambitious people could build new kinds of lives, free from the limitations imposed by older, more established societies. But that promise had traditionally applied only to men seeking economic opportunities, not to women challenging professional boundaries. Brennan consulted his pocket watch, clearly calculating how much time he could spend on negotiations that had already exceeded the scope of his original mission. I don't have authority to approve such an arrangement. That would require territorial legislature review, medical board evaluation, probably federal oversight, given the precedent implications. Then let's start that process, Margaret replied immediately. We're not asking for immediate approval. We're asking for the opportunity to prove our proposal has merit worth serious consideration. The marshal looked around the cabin complex, taking in the evidence of systematic medical practice and educational activity. The building that had served as their primary treatment facility was clearly designed for clinical work, with proper ventilation, adequate lighting, and equipment storage that met professional standards. The library of medical texts was extensive and current. The training materials were comprehensive and well organized. Most importantly, the testimonials were undeniable. During Brennan's investigation, he had interviewed dozens of people who had received treatment at the mountain facility. Miners whose broken bones had been properly set, trappers whose infected wounds had been successfully treated, families whose children had been delivered safely in emergency situations. The evidence of competent medical practice was overwhelming. 6 months, he said finally. I'll recommend that territorial authorities grant you 6 months to formalize your proposal and demonstrate that this arrangement can meet official standards for medical education and practice. But understand that you'll be under constant scrutiny during that period. Any evidence of improper procedures, inadequate documentation, or inappropriate conduct will result in immediate closure and prosecution. Margaret felt her heart pound with a mixture of relief and terror. 6 months to prove that their revolutionary approach to medical education could satisfy bureaucratic requirements while maintaining the practical effectiveness that had made it valuable to mountain communities. 6 months to transform an informal practice into an institution that could survive official oversight and serve as a model for similar facilities elsewhere. We "Accept those terms," she replied without consulting her sisters, knowing they trusted her judgment and shared her commitment to preserving what they had built together. As Marshal Brennan departed to file his report with territorial authorities, the sisters and their chosen father gathered to contemplate the magnitude of what they had committed themselves to accomplish. Creating an official medical institution would require resources they didn't possess, expertise they would have to acquire, and political navigation skills none of them had ever needed to develop, but more challenging than the practical requirements was the psychological adjustment required to function within official oversight while maintaining the innovative approaches that had made their work effective. They would have to prove their methods to evaluators who might not understand the unique requirements of backcountry medical practice. They would have to document their procedures for bureaucrats who had never faced medical emergencies in wilderness conditions. Most difficult of all, they would have to defend their right to practice medicine. As women, to authorities who believed female medical practitioners required constant male supervision to maintain professional standards and moral propriety. The next 6 months passed in a blur of intense activity that tested every capability they had developed during their education. They wrote formal curricula that translated their intuitive teaching methods into structured academic programs. They created documentation systems that satisfied bureaucratic requirements while remaining practical for clinical use. They established admission standards for students who wanted to learn wilderness medicine techniques, but the greatest challenge came from unexpected quarters. Word of the Mountain Medical Institute spread throughout the territory, attracting attention from conventional medical establishments who saw their innovative approaches as threats to established professional authority. Licensed physicians in Portland and Salem began organizing opposition to territorial recognition of the mountain facility, arguing that medical education should remain centralized in urban institutions where it could be properly supervised and controlled. The political battle that ensued forced the sisters to become advocates for their own institution while continuing to provide medical services to communities that depended on their expertise. They traveled to territorial capital to testify before legislative committees, wrote detailed reports defending their educational methods, and submitted to inspections by medical evaluators who often seemed more interested in finding violations than recognizing innovations. Margaret found herself speaking before audiences of territorial officials who had never ventured beyond urban centers, trying to explain why mountain communities needed different approaches to medical care than were practical in established cities. Catherine became an expert in bureaucratic procedures, learning to navigate regulatory requirements that seemed designed to discourage rather than facilitate new institutional arrangements. Sarah developed into a masterful advocate for practical medical education, demonstrating wilderness medicine techniques for evaluators who had never considered that standard medical school training might be inadequate for frontier conditions. Rebecca, despite her youth, became their most effective spokesperson for the human impact of their work, sharing stories of patients whose lives had been saved by medical care that wouldn't have been available through conventional channels. The opposition they faced was more sophisticated and better funded than they had anticipated. Established medical schools argued that women lacked the intellectual capacity for advanced medical education. Urban physicians claimed that wilderness medicine was inferior to standard treatments available in properly equipped facilities. Political opponents suggested that territorial recognition of the Mountain Medical Institute would encourage other unconventional institutions that might undermine established educational standards, but the sisters had advantages their opponents couldn't match. They had documented evidence of successful medical outcomes. They had testimonials from grateful patients whose lives had been saved by treatments unavailable elsewhere. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that their educational methods could train competent medical practitioners in environments where conventional medical schools were impractical or impossible. The final evaluation came in late autumn, when a panel of territorial medical authorities arrived to conduct comprehensive assessment of the Mountain Medical Institute's facilities, procedures, and educational outcomes. The inspection team included licensed physicians from established medical schools, territorial health officials, and legislative representatives charged with determining whether the mountain facility deserved official recognition. Margaret stood before the evaluation panel in the main treatment facility, surrounded by evidence of everything they had accomplished during their months of desperate effort. Medical equipment that met professional standards, documentation systems that satisfied bureaucratic requirements, educational materials that demonstrated systematic approach to wilderness medicine training, and most importantly, the living proof of their success in the form of students who had learned to provide competent medical care under their instruction. Dr. Harrison, she addressed the chief evaluator, a distinguished physician from Portland Medical College. We believe the Mountain Medical Institute represents a new model for medical education that serves populations and meets needs that conventional medical schools cannot address. We've demonstrated that women can provide excellent medical education and practice when given the opportunity to prove their capabilities. We've shown that wilderness medicine requires specialized training that urban medical schools don't provide. Most importantly, we've proven that innovative approaches to medical education can produce competent practitioners while serving communities that have no other access to healthcare. The silence that followed her presentation seemed to stretch for eternity. The evaluation panel's decision would determine not just the fate of their institution, but the possibility that other women might someday have access to the same opportunities they had fought so hard to create. Dr. Harrison consulted his notes with the deliberate precision of someone whose words would become official territorial policy. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of recognition that what they had accomplished challenged fundamental assumptions about medical education, professional competence, and women's capabilities. The Mountain Medical Institute will receive conditional territorial recognition for a 2-year probationary period, subject to annual evaluation and continued demonstration of educational and clinical standards. This recognition acknowledges that the Institute serves genuine public health needs while maintaining professional standards that meet territorial requirements. For medical practice, Margaret felt tears of relief streaming down her face as her sisters surrounded her in embraces that celebrated not just their personal victory, but the precedent they had established for other women who might dare to challenge professional limitations. They had proven that competence mattered more than convention, that innovation could satisfy official requirements while serving human needs, and that women could create institutions that changed the world when they refused to accept the boundaries others tried to impose. The 4 sisters who had once huddled desperately around a kitchen table, counting coins that would never be enough, had become founders of an institution that would train medical practitioners for generations. They had transformed personal tragedy into public service, individual growth into institutional change, and desperate survival into purposeful leadership. Their return to the world had not meant surrender to its limitations, but victory over forces that tried to diminish their potential. They had proved that sometimes the greatest challenge is not learning to survive in the world as it exists, but finding the courage to change that world into something better than what you found. 3 years after the Mountain Medical Institute received territorial recognition, the impact of the Patterson sisters' transformation had spread far beyond the boundaries of their original mountain sanctuary. What had begun as desperate survival had evolved into a movement that challenged fundamental assumptions about women's capabilities, medical education, and the delivery of healthcare to underserved populations. The institute itself had grown into a thriving complex of buildings nestled in the high valley that had once sheltered 4 starving girls. The original cabin where Ezra Thorne had saved their lives now served as the administrative center for an institution that attracted students from across the Western Territories. Young women arrived monthly to begin comprehensive programs in wilderness medicine, and their graduates were establishing similar facilities throughout the mountain regions of Colorado. Montana and California. Margaret stood in the new lecture hall, addressing a class of 23 students who had traveled from as far as Texas and Minnesota to receive training unavailable anywhere else in the country. At 25, she'd become one of the youngest medical college directors in America. But her authority came not from formal credentials, but from demonstrated results that even skeptical evaluators could no longer dispute. Emergency medicine in remote locations requires different thinking than treatment in established facilities, she explained to the attentive faces before her. You can't rely on equipment you don't have, supplies you can't obtain, or backup support that's days away. Success depends on thorough preparation, creative problem-solving, and absolute confidence in your own capabilities. The students scribbled notes with the intensity of people who understood they were learning, skills that might someday save their own lives, or the lives of people they cared about. Many were daughters of frontier families who had experienced firsthand the dangers of living beyond the reach of conventional medical care. Others were unmarried women seeking professional opportunities that would provide both meaningful work and economic independence. After the lecture, Margaret walked through facilities that represented the physical manifestation of dreams she could never have imagined during her family's desperate winter. The surgical training center where Catherine taught advanced procedures to students who would never see the inside of a traditional operating room. The botanical laboratory where Sarah developed new applications for medicinal plants found in mountain environments. The patient simulation facility where Rebecca trained students in diagnostic techniques using case studies, drawn from their growing collection of wilderness medical experiences. But the most significant changes were visible beyond the Institute's boundaries. In communities throughout the Mountain West, where graduates had established clinics, training centers, and medical supply networks that served populations previously ignored by conventional healthcare systems. The ripple effects of their success had created opportunities for hundreds of women who might otherwise have remained trapped in limiting circumstances. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had been among their first graduating class, a young woman from New Mexico whose family had lost their ranch to drought and economic pressure. She now operated a clinic in the Colorado mining districts, providing medical care to workers whose dangerous occupations generated constant need for emergency treatment. Her annual reports documented injury rates reduced by 40% through preventive education and early intervention techniques learned at the Mountain Medical Institute. Mary Catherine Sullivan, daughter of Irish immigrants who had struggled to survive in Montana's harsh winters, had established a network of birthing centers that served rural communities where women previously faced childbirth without professional assistance. Her maternal mortality statistics were better than those achieved in many urban hospitals, proving that wilderness medicine techniques could produce superior outcomes when properly applied. Even more significant were the secondary effects of their graduates' work. Young women throughout the Mountain West were growing up with expanded ideas about their own possibilities, seeing professional competence and economic independence as achievable goals rather than impossible dreams. Marriage was becoming a choice rather than necessity for survival, and motherhood was being pursued by women who had other options rather than those who had none. The transformation wasn't limited to medical practice. The Institute's success had sparked broader conversations about women's education, professional opportunities, and social roles throughout the Western Territories. Legislative bodies were considering bills that would expand women's property rights, educational access, and legal standing. Even Eastern newspapers were covering the Oregon experiment as a potential model for addressing the shortage of medical practitioners in frontier regions. But perhaps the most profound changes were occurring within the families and communities touched by Institute graduates. Catherine received regular correspondence from women whose lives had been transformed by encounters with their former students, wives who had learned to provide medical care for their families, daughters who had discovered they possessed capabilities their mothers never imagined, communities that had developed confidence in their ability to handle emergencies without depending on distant authorities. One letter particularly moved all four sisters when they read it during their weekly planning meeting. It came from Martha Henderson, widow of the man who had died alongside their father in the high country search for silver. She had enrolled in the Institute's community education program after her husband's death, learning basic medical skills that enabled her to support her children by providing healthcare services to neighboring families. "I thought my life was over when Walt died," she wrote. "I saw myself as a burden on my children, useless except for the domestic work that any woman could perform. But the training I received at your institute taught me that I had capabilities I never suspected. I'm now the primary medical provider for 3 mountain communities, and my children see their mother as someone who saves lives rather than someone who needs to be supported. You didn't just teach me medical skills. You gave me back my sense of worth and purpose." The letter represented thousands of similar transformations that had occurred as the Institute's influence spread throughout the region. Women who had accepted limited definitions of their own value were discovering capabilities that expanded their sense of what was possible. Communities were becoming more self-reliant as residents learned to handle medical emergencies that had previously required dangerous journeys to distant towns. Sarah had become particularly interested in documenting these broader social changes, compiling data that demonstrated the economic and social benefits of investing in women's medical education. Her research showed that communities served by Institute graduates experienced lower infant mortality rates, reduced economic losses from preventable injuries, and increased population stability, as families felt safer remaining in remote locations. "We're not just training individual practitioners," she explained during a presentation to territorial legislators. "Considering expanded funding for the Institute, we're creating community resilience that supports economic development and population growth throughout the mountain regions." The economic arguments were compelling, but the human stories were even more powerful. Rebecca had developed into a masterful communicator who could translate abstract policy discussions into concrete examples of how medical education changed real lives. Her presentations featured case studies of children whose lives had been saved by timely medical intervention, families who had remained in productive mountain communities because healthcare was available, and women who had discovered economic independence through medical practice, but the ripple effects extended beyond individual success. Stories to encompass broader cultural changes that challenged traditional assumptions about gender roles and professional boundaries. The Institute's graduates were proving that women could provide excellent medical care in the most challenging environments, that practical training could produce competent practitioners without traditional academic credentials, and that innovative approaches to education could address social needs that conventional institutions ignored. The success had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Medical schools in eastern cities were beginning to modify their curricula to include wilderness medicine training. Women's colleges were developing programs that emphasized practical skills alongside theoretical knowledge. Even international observers were studying the Oregon model as a potential solution to healthcare delivery challenges in remote regions of their own countries. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to receive a medical degree in America, visited the Institute during the spring of their 4th year of operation. Her presence validated their work in ways that official recognition had never quite achieved. connecting their innovative experiment to the broader struggle for women's professional equality. What you've accomplished here represents more than medical education. Dr. Blackwell observed during her tour of the facilities, "You've proven that women can create institutions that serve social needs while challenging conventional limitations on female achievement. This institute will inspire similar efforts throughout the country." The prediction proved accurate. Within 2 years of Dr. Blackwell's visit, similar institutions had been established in 6 other states, each adapted to local conditions, but following the basic model developed in the Oregon mountains. The network of graduates was creating a communications system that shared innovations, coordinated resources, and provided mutual support for women practicing medicine in challenging environments. But perhaps the most significant ripple effect was the change in how young women throughout the region thought about their own futures. Margaret regularly received letters from teenagers who were planning their education around careers they had never previously considered possible. Daughters of farmers were learning that they could become medical practitioners rather than simply wives and mothers. Girls from poor families were discovering that professional competence could provide economic security without depending on marriage for survival. The transformation was so comprehensive that older residents sometimes struggled to recognize the communities they had known before the Institute's influence began to spread. Young women moved through their daily lives with confidence that previous generations had never displayed. Families made decisions about education and career development that assumed daughters possessed capabilities equal to sons. Communities invested in institutions and infrastructure that supported female professional development rather than simply accommodating male economic activities as the sisters gathered for their traditional evening meeting. In the cabin where their transformation had begun, they reflected on changes that exceeded their most ambitious early dreams. They had sought survival and discovered purpose. They had fought for recognition and achieved revolution. They had saved their own lives and created opportunities for thousands of others. Margaret looked around the table at her sisters, seeing women who had become leaders, innovators, and advocates for social change that reached far beyond their individual circumstances. Catherine's practical genius had created administrative systems that enabled the Institute to function efficiently while maintaining its innovative character. Sarah's research had provided the evidence base that convinced skeptical authorities to support their work. Rebecca's communication skills had built public understanding and support for their mission. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd made different choices that night in the blizzard? Sarah asked, voicing a question they all occasionally contemplated. Catherine smiled, her green eyes reflecting the firelight that had warmed so many planning sessions. We'd probably be living conventional lives in some conventional place, never knowing what we were capable of accomplishing when survival required us to exceed every limitation we'd accepted about ourselves. Rebecca, now 20 and serving as the Institute's primary liaison with territorial authorities, added her perspective with the wisdom that early hardship and subsequent success had taught her. I think we would have spent our entire lives wondering why we felt so restless and unfulfilled, never understanding that we were meant for something larger than what our world originally offered us. Margaret nodded, understanding that their desperate flight into the mountains had been less about escaping death than about finding life authentic enough to be worth living. We thought we were looking for rescue, but what we really needed was the chance to discover who we could become when everything familiar was stripped away. Ezra, now in his 60s, but still possessing the strength and wisdom that had saved them during their darkest hour, offered the observation that connected their personal transformation to its broader implications. What you've created here proves that sometimes the most important changes begin with individuals who refuse to accept limitations that seem absolute to everyone else. Your willingness to risk everything for the chance to become yourselves has given hundreds of other women permission to imagine different possibilities for their own lives. The Conversation continued late into the night, as their evening meetings always did, but now their planning encompassed initiatives that would affect thousands of people across multiple states and territories. They discussed expansion strategies, funding proposals, legislative advocacy, and international collaborations that would extend their influence far beyond the mountain valleys. Where their journey had begun, the four sisters, who had once counted coins that would never be enough, now managed budgets that supported educational programs, research initiatives, and community development projects throughout the western regions of America. They had transformed personal desperation into institutional innovation, individual growth into social change, and private survival into public service that would benefit generations. They would never meet. Their ripple effect had become a wave of transformation that was reshaping how entire communities thought about women's capabilities, medical education, and the delivery of healthcare to underserved populations. They had proven that sometimes the most powerful changes begin not with grand gestures or institutional reforms, but with individuals who find the courage to become everything they were meant to be when survival requires them to exceed every limitation they had previously accepted about themselves. 25 years after four starving sisters had stumbled into a mountain blizzard, the Oregon Territory prepared to celebrate the silver anniversary of the Mountain Medical Institute with ceremonies that would attract dignitaries from across the nation. But for Margaret Patterson, now 51, and recognized as one of the most influential educators in American medical history, the true measure of their legacy lay not in official recognition, but in the lives that had been transformed by the choice they had made to risk everything, rather than accept limitations others tried to impose. She stood in the memorial garden behind the Institute's main building, surrounded by commemorative stones that honored the graduates who had died in service to remote communities throughout the American West. Dr. Maria Santos, killed in an avalanche while treating miners trapped in a Colorado cave-in. Nurse Helen Morrison, who succumbed to cholera while caring for victims of an epidemic in Montana mining camps. Dr. Catherine Walsh, lost in a blizzard while racing to deliver a baby in an isolated Wyoming homestead. Each stone represented not just individual sacrifice, but the courage of women who had chosen meaningful service over personal safety, who had used the skills learned in these mountains to save lives in places where conventional medicine could never have reached. Their deaths had meaning because their lives had purpose, because they had become something larger than what their original circumstances would have allowed. Rebecca approached through the garden paths, her graying hair catching the morning sunlight as she carried the daily correspondence that kept the Institute connected to its far-flung network of graduates and associated institutions. At 38, she had become the Institute's primary chronicler, documenting the stories and tracking the achievements of women whose careers had begun in these mountain classrooms. "The annual reports are in," she announced, settling onto the bench beside Margaret with the comfortable familiarity of sisters who had shared a lifetime of challenges and triumphs. "Our graduates are now providing primary medical care to over 200 communities across 17 states and territories. The maternal mortality rates in their service areas are 40% lower than national averages. Child mortality has dropped by 60% in communities served by Institute-trained practitioners for more than 5 years. The statistics were impressive, but they represented human stories that gave the numbers their true significance. Thousands of women who had survived childbirth because skilled hands were available to guide them through complications. Hundreds of children who had lived to adulthood because medical knowledge was present when accidents and illnesses threatened their lives. Countless families who had remained in productive frontier communities because healthcare was available to sustain them through the inevitable medical crises that wilderness living entailed. Catherine emerged from the administrative building where she had been reviewing budget projections for the Institute's expansion into the Dakota Territory. At 50, she retained the practical efficiency that had sustained her family through their darkest times. But her responsibilities now encompassed financial management of an institution whose annual budget exceeded the operating costs of many small cities. The territorial legislature has approved our proposal for the Northern Plains Medical Training Center, she reported with satisfaction. Full funding for the first 3 years with renewable support based on demonstrated results. We'll be able to start accepting students next spring. The expansion represented more than institutional growth. It acknowledged that the Oregon model had proven its value beyond any reasonable doubt. Government officials who had once viewed the institute with suspicion now competed to attract similar facilities to their own regions, recognizing the economic and social benefits that accompanied investment in women's medical education. Sarah joined them from the botanical laboratory where she had been, developing new applications for medicinal plants native to different geographical regions. Her research had evolved from practical necessity into systematic study that was revolutionizing understanding of plant-based therapeutics throughout the medical profession. Academic journals that had initially dismissed her work as frontier folk medicine now published her findings as cutting-edge research in pharmaceutical development. The University of California wants to establish a collaborative program, she announced, consulting notes written in her careful handwriting. They're offering to create a department of wilderness pharmacology based on our research methods. Full academic recognition, research funding, and the opportunity to train graduate students in botanical medicine applications. The offer represented vindication that went beyond personal satisfaction to encompass recognition of innovative research methods that had emerged from practical necessity rather than academic theory. Sarah's work had demonstrated that systematic study of traditional healing practices could advance medical knowledge in ways that conventional pharmaceutical research had overlooked. As the four sisters gathered in their traditional circle, the setting had changed dramatically from their early meetings around Ezra's fireplace, but the fundamental dynamic remained the same. They were still collaborators in an enterprise that exceeded any individual contribution, still committed to purposes that transcended personal ambition, still bound together by shared understanding of what was possible when human potential was allowed to develop without artificial limitations. Ezra Thorne had died peacefully 3 years earlier, surrounded by the women he had chosen as family and the institution he had helped them create. His memorial service had drawn hundreds of people, whose lives had been touched by his decision to rescue 4 desperate girls and transform them into leaders whose influence would extend far beyond anything he could have imagined. His final words, spoken to Margaret during his last conscious moments, had been, "You became everything I hoped you could be, and far more than I ever dreamed was possible." The institute itself had evolved into a complex of buildings that served multiple functions while maintaining the essential character that had made it effective from the beginning. The original cabin, where they had learned their first lessons in wilderness medicine, was now preserved as a museum that reminded visitors of the humble origins from which their revolutionary enterprise had grown. The memorial library contained Ezra's medical texts, alongside contemporary research that built upon foundations he had established, but the most significant legacy was visible in the hundreds of women who arrived each year to begin educational programs that would enable them to provide essential services in communities throughout the American frontier. They came from every social background and geographical region, united by determination to develop capabilities that would allow them to serve human needs while achieving economic independence and professional recognition. Margaret watched a group of first-year students practicing emergency procedures in the training courtyard, seeing in their focused intensity the same hunger for authentic purpose that had driven her own transformation decades earlier. These young women would graduate to establish clinics in mining camps, provide medical care for ranch families scattered across vast territories, and develop innovations in wilderness medicine that would advance the profession in ways their urban colleagues could never achieve. Do you ever wonder what our lives would have been like if we'd made different choices? Catherine asked, voicing a question that occasionally surfaced during their reflective moments. Sarah smiled, her expression reflecting the deep satisfaction that came from work that had proven its value beyond any doubt. I think we would have spent our entire lives feeling that something was missing, never understanding that we were meant for something larger than what conventional paths offered. Rebecca, whose storytelling gifts had found their ultimate expression in documenting the Institute's impact on individual lives and broader social change, offered the perspective that connected their personal journey to its historical significance. We thought we were trying to survive, but what we were really doing was discovering that survival sometimes requires becoming someone entirely different from who you started out being. Margaret nodded, understanding that their desperate flight into the mountains had been less about escaping death than about finding life authentic enough to justify the risks required to achieve it. We were looking for rescue, but what we found was the opportunity to become rescuers ourselves. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Emily Chen, one of their most recent graduates, who had traveled from her clinic in the Nevada silver mining district to participate in the anniversary celebrations. At 28, she represented the third generation of women whose professional opportunities had been created by the Institute's success, and her achievements demonstrated how far the ripple effects of their original transformation had spread. "Dr. Patterson," she announced breathlessly, "I wanted to thank you personally before the formal ceremonies begin. The training I received here saved my life last month when a mine collapse trapped me underground with 6 injured workers. Without the wilderness medicine techniques you taught me, none of us would have survived until rescue teams reached us." The story represented thousands of similar incidents where Institute graduates had used their training to preserve life in situations where conventional medical education would have provided inadequate preparation. Their emphasis on practical skills, creative problem-solving, and confidence under pressure had proven its value in circumstances that no traditional medical school could have anticipated or prepared students to handle. But beyond the technical competence they provided, Institute graduates brought something equally valuable to the communities they served: the understanding that women could be relied upon to handle the most challenging circumstances with skill and courage. Their presence changed fundamental assumptions about female capabilities, creating opportunities for younger women who grew up seeing professional competence and economic independence as achievable goals rather than impossible dreams. As the anniversary celebration began with speeches from territorial officials, medical school representatives, and women's rights advocates, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them from desperate survival to institutional leadership. The recognition was gratifying, but the true satisfaction came from understanding that their individual transformation had created possibilities for thousands of women who might otherwise have remained trapped in limiting circumstances. The keynote address was delivered by Dr. Susan McKinney, the third African-American woman to earn a medical degree in the United States, who had traveled from Brooklyn to acknowledge the Institute's role in expanding opportunities for women in medicine. Her presence symbolized the broader impact of their work, connecting their regional innovation to national movements for professional equality and social justice. The Mountain Medical Institute has proven that excellence in medical education can emerge from the most unexpected circumstances. Dr. McKinney declared to the assembled audience, "These 4 women have demonstrated that when human potential is allowed to develop without artificial limitations, the results exceed anything that conventional institutions could have achieved through traditional methods." as the ceremonies concluded and visitors departed to carry news of the Institute's achievements to their own communities. The sisters gathered once more in the memorial garden where they had begun their morning reflections. The setting sun painted the mountain peaks in shades of gold and rose that reminded them of the countless evenings they had spent planning their impossible enterprise around Ezra's fireplace. Margaret looked at her sisters, seeing women who had become leaders in fields that hadn't existed when their education began. Innovators whose work had changed fundamental assumptions about medical practice and women's capabilities. Advocates whose efforts had created opportunities that would benefit generations they would never meet. "We've built something that will outlast us," she observed, her voice carrying the quiet satisfaction that came from understanding that their life's work had achieved permanence beyond their individual existence. Catherine nodded, her practical mind already calculating the implications of their institutional legacy. "The women who graduate from here 50 years from now will face challenges we can't imagine, but they'll have the same foundation we tried to provide. The knowledge that human potential has no limits except those we accept for ourselves." Sarah, whose research had opened new frontiers in botanical medicine, added her perspective on the broader implications of their achievement. "We've proven that innovation comes from people who are willing to question conventional wisdom and develop new approaches to old problems. That principle will remain valuable no matter how much the world changes around it." Rebecca, whose documentation of their journey had preserved the stories that gave meaning to their institutional success, offered the observation that connected their personal transformation to its lasting significance. "We've shown that sometimes the most important changes begin with individuals who refuse to accept limitations that seem absolute to everyone else. That refusal creates possibilities that ripple outward to affect people and places far beyond the original source." As darkness settled over the mountain valley where their journey had begun, the four sisters understood that their legacy was secured, not in buildings or institutions, but in the lives they had touched and the possibilities they had created. 4 desperate girls had become 4 accomplished women, and in doing so had proven that human potential could transcend any limitation when courage was combined with opportunity and purpose. The same stars appeared with the same brilliance that had comforted them during their first night in Ezra's cabin, when survival had seemed impossible and transformation was beyond their imagination. Now they knew that both had been achieved through choices made one day at a time, one challenge at a time, one life at a time, until the cumulative effect had changed not just their own circumstances, but the world they inhabited. Their story had become part of the larger narrative of American expansion and innovation, proving that sometimes the most significant progress comes not from those who accept the world as they find it, but from those who discover the courage to create the world they need. The Mountain Medical Institute would continue their work for generations, but the true legacy was the understanding that human potential knows no boundaries except those we impose upon ourselves. The gentle mountain man who had found 4 starving sisters in the forest had given them more than rescue. He had given them the opportunity to discover who they were meant to become, and in becoming themselves, they had created possibilities for countless others to do the same. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.